Hi, I'm Dr. Chetna Kang, and these are my words to live by. So something that I feel is really helpful for people to understand is that our minds are much more than our brains, and we are also more than just our mind, our brain, and our body. This is really helpful because it introduces this idea of spirituality in a very universal way, that we are all more than what the world believes we are. We are all more than the changes that happen to us physiologically and physically from childhood through to adulthood. We are much more than the personality changes and the changes in our tastes and preferences that evolve as we grow throughout our lives. And that sense of self that's separate from our roles and identities in the outside world, that sense of self that is independent of those things, this is really coming from a place of a witness consciousness, that bit of me that's watched all of these changes happen in my life, that has continued to watch but not be affected, observed but not be affected. So this spirituality is something that everybody has, regardless of our belief system, our faith, whether we have a religion or not. And something that has really fascinated the medical world, the scientific world, is the relationship between spirituality and our mental well-being. Now, we know spirituality is good for our mental well-being, but how? So there are 5 key areas of spirituality that are well-researched and very evidence-based to actually improve our mental health through biological ways, through our neurochemistry, through psychological ways, through our thinking processes, and also through our external world, our relationships. All of these things are made more resilient by particular spiritual aspects and practices so that we have a much healthier mind. So the first one that's been very well researched is the practices around spirituality, or the practices that make up part of spirituality. So for example, meditation, prayer, yoga, any practice that you feel, whether it's faith-based or independent of a particular faith, which really nourishes that sense of self, which is separate from the body and the brain and the mind and our social roles, has a really positive impact on the mind, really has a positive impact on our mental health. And this is mediated through our physiology, it's mediated through various neurochemistry to a point where our brain actually changes. The parts of our brain which are to do with fear tend to shrink, and the parts of our brain which are to do with feeling safe and confident tend to evolve much more. You also notice with practices like prayer, meditation, and yoga, well researched to show that actually for your physical health they're very good as well. Your blood pressure lowers, your pulse rate lowers, all signs of reducing stress, and regulates your cortisol levels. So this is our first pillar of spirituality and how it's good for your mental health. The second pillar is the positive spiritual psychology. Now, this goes beyond popular psychology. For example, we look at attitudes like forgiveness and gratitude. Yes, they do help us to move forward, to be happy, to overcome trauma. But the roots of forgiveness, kindness, gratitude, they lie much deeper than just the resting place of the mind and the brain. They come from a place which is also a much deeper aspect of ourselves, where we don't have to learn how to do those things. And spirituality and spiritual cultures and communities help us to develop and encourage us to develop those attitudes in a community-based way, in a way where we are supported. And actually this naturally leads to the third pillar, that generally those who are practicing spirituality or religion have a like-minded community. Again, something that's really positive for our mental health. We are not an island, okay? We're not alone. We're never alone. And yet, even when we're with others, we can be lonely. However, when it comes to having a like-minded community, especially one which encourages cultivating that side of ourself that's independent of the transient ego, the transient sense of self, that sense of self that's always changing. So those kinds of communities really have a positive impact on our mental health. So much so that research has found that people who try to practice spirituality without a like-minded community may find themselves more vulnerable to mental health problems because they often have existential questions but no one to take them to and no answers. And even when they get answers, the application becomes difficult. This brings me to the fourth pillar, which is sacred architecture. The external sacred space has been very much explored and researched, again, religious and non-religious, in terms of the geometry, the architecture of the space, the fragrances, the sounds, the visuals. All of these lend themselves to creating a channel to our internal sacred space. Again, that part of us which is independent from this ever-changing world and ever-changing worldly identity. And just being in these sacred spaces, whether you create one in your home or whether you go outside of your home to visit one, that natural environment and natural to a part of ourselves that isn't conditioned by the outside world has, again, a very pacifying influence on the mind, because it's connecting with a part of us which is actually in control of the mind ultimately, and should be in control of the mind, especially when it's well nourished. And if we look at nature, it is naturally a sacred space when untampered with, because by design it is connected and all flowing in a harmonious way. And last but not least, the fifth pillar of spirituality that is good for your mental health is a collaborative relationship with divinity. So whichever form of divinity, whichever way you see divinity, either as a pervasive force or a connection between all of us, or divinity within your own heart, or divinity as a person, as God, that relationship, when it's collaborative, is known to be good for our mental health because it brings that locus of control, our ability to influence and affect change in our life, back into our court, which means that then the relationship with divinity is one where there is choice, one where there is give and take, one where there is awareness, rather than a relationship which is based on fear, can often leave people feeling very guilty, having a lot of self-resentment, and feeling disempowered. Now, these 5 pillars are good for your mental health. They're not replacements for treatment if you do have mental illness, but they will certainly support recovery, they will support prevention, and they're easy for anyone to access. So, just as a quick reminder, the 5 pillars of spirituality that are good for your mental health are the practices, the positive psychology, a like-minded spiritual community, sacred architecture, and a collaborative relationship with divinity. I wish you all the best.